Greetings from Wisconsin. I am Caroline Gottschalk Druschke, an assistant professor in the Composition and Rhetoric program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm representing the work of myself and co-author Lily Lewis, a University of Florida postdoctoral fellow and bryologist. That means she studies mosses for a living. Hence our paper title, Community Building in Extreme Environments, Lessons from Sphagnum Moss Microbiome. We're really sorry not to join you in person this week at the conference, but since proposing this panel, I've moved from University of Rhode Island to UW, and my fall semester got a lot more complicated. So thank you for putting up with my video participation. I know it isn't an ideal medium, but I didn't want Jody and Jeremiah to have to deal with Skype complications, so I'm happy to still have a chance to add a voice to the conversation, though I'm bummed to miss the early morning cheese tasting. To give you a little background, the impulse that pulled this panel together was a collective urge to pressure the decades-long move towards ecologies in composition and rhetoric, at least since 1986, when Marilyn Cooper conceived of an ecological model of writing. Rhetorical studies has worked to attend to the social, not solitary, nature of textual production. As Jenny Rice, rethinking Lloyd Bitzer's notion of the static rhetorical situation, put in her landmark essay on the subject in 2005, quote, I look towards a framework of affective ecologies that recontextualizes rhetorics in their temporal, historical, and lived fluxes, end quote. This notion of rhetoric as emerging not just from a static location out there, but from an entangled active process or ecology in here, of enmeshment in temporal, historical, and lived fluxes, has become a dominant paradigm in rhetorical studies, as this conference theme, engaging networks and ecologies, might suggest. Yet Jody, Jeremiah, Lily, and I wanted to focus our attention in this panel on what we see as a current impulse towards using ecologies to speak primarily as a metaphor or analog for the circulation of discourses, texts, images, and emotions that conspire to move the soul to feeling. And so, in addition to a focus on text and affect, we have been working to incorporate some of the practices and perspectives of ecological science in our rhetorical studies with microbes. That interest has led me towards focusing on the central ecological concept of trophic interaction, the dynamics of matter and energy flowing through an ecosystem, to consider what a more deliberately material concept of relationality, from ecological to something more like trophic, might offer to shared interests in communities and community writing. Here we adopt a trophic orientation to consider the rich possibilities for the pairings of rhetorical studies with ecological science, the radically communal vision of the individual that can result from such perspectives, and the consequences of an aggressively multiple sense of community for work in community-based writing and public engagement. We hope that our work might offer a radically different view of community from traditional conceptions in community-based writing. Like our co-panelists, Lily and I have the sense that this trophic approach to rethinking communities and a concurrent attention to the sorts of relationships of mutualism, commensalism, competition, and predation that they entail could actually help us to reconsider possibilities for agency and action in sometimes surprising ways for a variety of human and other than human actors. In our speculative talk today, Lily and I tried to do that creative, trophic co-thinking, focused on the inspiring work of the oft-neglected group of non-vascular plants called the mosses. Now, I am a moss novice, but Lily, on the other hand, has been aptly dubbed Queen of the Mosses, having studied them from Cape Horn to Alaska and authoring multiple books and many peer-reviewed articles on the subject. Her work on mosses has even been featured by the BBC. Lily and I met in January 2016 when I traveled down to Omura Ethnobotanical Park on Isla Navarino in southern Chile's Region 12, where she was then a postdoc and long-term researcher and educator. To get to Omura, you fly south to Punta Arenas, the world's southernmost city of more than 100,000 people, and keep going. You'll arrive in the park after a 36-hour ferry ride towards Cape Horn through the Strait of Magellan. Serving as the research center for the Cape Horn Biosphere Reserve, which hosts one of the most diverse communities of mosses on the planet, Isla Navarino is a wild and beautiful place. Beaver pelts hanging from cottages, wild horses and wild dogs roaming through the village square, and high-end heli fishermen riding in on the ferry. In a place marked so vividly by invasion, European settlers, Chilean military, North American beavers, colonialist horses, and roving dogs, it's no surprise that the mosses, too, hitched a ride to get there. Lilly's research in species dispersal was the first to provide direct evidence supporting the role of long-distance migrant birds in shaping moss distributions across the Americas. Lilly and her colleagues showed that migratory birds departing northern high-latitude breeding ranges for southern hemisphere wintering ranges carried in their feathers spores and bits of moss leaves capable of growing into new plants. Through her work in dispersal and genetics, as well as environmental education at O'Mora Park, where she leads students and visitors through the so-called miniature forests of Cape Horn with a small hand lens, Lilly has earned her queenly title. When we first met in 2016, we hit it off because at the same time that she was working on this cutting-edge research in genetics, Lilly had also been thinking deeply about the place of ethics, discourse, naming, and power in the evolution and study of mosses. Long after I left Chile and Lilly moved from O'Mora Park to her current Alaska-focused postdoc at the University of Florida, we kept trading emails about plant theory, broadly construed, and worked on an article now in press about the power of moss naming for extending ethics to what she referred to as underperceived beings. This presentation is an early attempt for us to consider the consequences of that 2-year conversation for community-based writing and rhetoric. We know we're not the first to think about plants in relation to rhetoric and composition, but it seems fair to suggest that plants have been wildly neglected in our discipline. We have James Wynn's 2007 article, Alone in the Garden, How Gregor Mendel's Inattention to Audience May Have Affected the Reception of His Theory of Inheritance in Experiments in Plant Hybridization for Plant Science as Content, and John Mucklebauer's great recent chapter about heliotropism and Barnett and Boyle's Rhetoric Through Everyday Things for Plant Science as Theory. But we have to look slightly further afield for our plant thinking, which Jeff Nealon, Rich Doyle, and Deleuze and Guattari notwithstanding, even then is scarce. But this is fertile territory. Bryologists like Lilly are in many ways the rhetoricians of plant academia. Vascular biologists who study flowering plants, conifers, and ferns tend to treat mosses, even in their peer-reviewed literature, as ancient, backwards, unevolved. Non-vascular mosses are frequently designed by an absence or distance from this dominant vascular center, while extant bryophytes have been traditionally portrayed in scientific narratives about land-plant evolution as early or lower or primitive relative to vascular plants, and even more markedly to flowering plants or higher plants. But this vascular-centric perspective is inconsistent with research about the evolution of mosses, which demonstrates that modern mosses undergo the same ongoing evolutionary processes as vascular plant lineages and, in fact, all life on Earth today. Thus, although bryophyte lineages diverged on their own evolutionary trajectories long before vascular plants evolved, modern bryophytes themselves are not ancient, early, or mere relics from the colonization of land by plants 500 million years ago. Adjectives such as lower, early, or primitive invoke a paradigm of evolutionary stagnation that is not supported by modern molecular phylogenetic data. In this dominant framing, the diversity of bryophytes found across the Earth today is misleadingly presented as consisting of passive relics from the past. In reality, though, mosses are wily and dynamic. As Lilly's research has shown, they do things like travel from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, hidden amongst bird feathers. Some moss species even grow out of literal shit and entice insects to do their bidding. Mosses are novel and adventurous, and their history and present speaks deeply to interests in migration and transformation, persistence and resilience. Taking a nod from Bruno Latour, then, who offered this offhand line in The Pasteurization of France, quote, "If you are mixed up with the trees, how do you know they are not using you to achieve their dark designs?" End quote. We want to take plants seriously here, and take ecology seriously more broadly, to consider what lessons these dynamic and oft overlooked mosses might offer for community building in fraught times, to consider the ways we might open ourselves to letting non-vascular plants, and not just trees, use us to achieve dark designs that might enrich us and in fact enable our own migration and transformation, persistence and resilience, and of special interest to us here, community building. So we focus here on the genus Sphagnum, the group name for roughly 300 to 500 species of moss worldwide, because of sphagnum's particularly innovative, inspirational, and even dark forms of community building. From the Greek word sphagnos, an unknown plant, sphagnum is actually a conspicuous, distinctive, and discipline-spanning plant. If you've ever seen a bog or glimpsed one in an Irish landscape painting, you actually know sphagnum mosses. What you might not know, though, are their unique properties. Sphagnum plays an active role in shaping its own bryosphere, a term that Lindo and Gonzalez explain connotes, quote, a spatially bounded whole ecosystem that integrates above ground and below ground processes, end quote. As they continue, the bryosphere, quote, emphasizes the combined role of mosses and their associated organisms in the functioning of ecosystems from local to global scales, end quote. Sphagnum actively participates in the cultivation of its associated ecological community, a highly acidic, largely inhospitable environment that accounts for those perfectly preserved 2,000-year-old bog bodies, if you've seen those, and allows sphagnum not to be overtaken and shaded by larger plants. Sphagnum, quote, wages chemical biowarfare, end quote, as Costa et al. Put it, quote, to outcompete other plants in its ecosystem, end quote. But it does that by also cultivating a diverse and supportive microbial community, or microbiome. In other words, sphagnum creates the conditions necessary to work in common with allies that support its own survival and to thwart enemies that don't. As Robin Wall Kimmerer put it in her 2003 opus, Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses, quote, I know of no plant, large or small, which has the ability to engineer the physical environment more thoroughly than sphagnum through the remarkable properties of the plant itself, end quote. The way it does that work is frankly stunning. As Brezhina et al. Explain in technical terms, quote, living sphagnum have extraordinarily high cation exchange capacity and therefore acidify their environment by exchanging tissue-bound protons for basic cations in surrounding water. In lay terms, that means that at the subatomic level, sphagnum moss enter into a relational exchange, swapping out acidic hydrogen ions for minerals like calcium and magnesium in the surrounding water. Bacteria and fungi work more slowly in this waterlogged, deoxygenated, acidic environment, inhibiting the usual process of decay while simultaneously growing new moss. This subatomic relationality helps to co-create the conditions necessary for sphagnum to thrive. Significantly, this give and take creates the community architecture necessary for sphagnum's success. As Kimmerer describes, the ground in a bog is not, in fact, quote, ground at all. It's only water, cleverly held by the architecture of moss, end quote. This architecture is supported by invisible structures. While we can glimpse the capitulum, the head of the sphagnum, held above the water, the remainder of the plant stretches far below, what Kimmerer calls, quote, pendant branches that hang from the nodes of the stem, end quote. This structural support is not only invisible. Think about the roots of a prairie plant extending deep beneath the black earth. It's also largely composed of dead tissue. As Kimmerer again describes, quote, under the microscope, you see that every leaf has narrow bands of living cells which border the patches of dead cells, like green hedgerows around empty pastures. Only one cell in 20 is actually alive. The others are merely dead cell walls, skeletons surrounding the open space where the cell contents used to be. These cells aren't diseased, she tells us. They achieve their mature, fully functioning status only when they are dead, end quote. Through death comes structure, purpose, and function. There seem to be lessons here for the sorts of exchanges and structures that support community writing and community-based writing. The importance of dynamic organic architecture, the largely invisible apparatus that actually does the difficult and largely unacknowledged work of supporting the community writing enterprise. The fact that current projects carry with them and are largely supported by the embodied ghosts of past relational exchanges. The necessity of constant relational exchange to support that work in the first place. But there are even more remarkable forces at work in the sphagnum bryosphere. Recent research by Brezhina, Berg, and Berg has come to some stunning conclusions about sphagnum community building. Their work demonstrated that, quote, bog vegetation harbored a core microbiome that is shared between plants and lichens over the whole ecosystem and formed a trans-kingdom metacommunity. All micro and macroorganisms are connected to keystone sphagnum mosses via a set of microbial species, end quote. I repeat, bog vegetation harbored a core microbiome that is shared between plants and lichens over the whole ecosystem and formed a trans-kingdom metacommunity. All micro and macroorganisms are connected to keystone sphagnum mosses via a set of microbial species. Think about that for a minute. As Brezina, Berg, and Berg go on to explain, quote, all bog plants are connected to a trans-kingdom metacommunity, a set of interacting communities which are linked by the dispersal of multiple potentially interacting species by their associated microbiota. The entire community is connected. This means there is a core microbiome shared by all plants in a bog, but there is also a portion of the sphagnum microbiome that is specific to sphagnum, and these microbial partners have the genetic machinery to potentially help sphagnum plants survive and thrive given their unique sets of challenges and superpowers. Sphagnum mosses offer important lessons in modularity and resilience. The trans-kingdom metacommunity they co-generate features components that are shared and components that are not, but they are part of the same dynamic yet persistent network. We admit that adopting a notion of trans-kingdom metacommunity for community writing might sound overzealous, oversimplified, or just plain silly. But again, we want to point to the surprising connections here. The ways that members of a community, more accurately from our trophic perspective, an ecological community or ecosystem, are knit together in microscopic, lively, bacterial, as well as subatomic ways. Might that perspective point us in community writing to put our faith in discovering and building from these and other sorts of surprising connections? Beyond connection, though, we want to point to the notion that rather than equal actors in a trans-kingdom metacommunity of the bog, there is power and agency at play in this network. As Foster et al. Suggested, quote, we cannot assume that a host, in this case sphagnum moss, and microbiota are a single evolutionary unit acting with a common interest, as is sometimes done in applications of the holobiont or superorganism metaphors, they tell us. Symbionts, they continue, commonly evolve to compete within a host ecosystem, while hosts, like sphagnum, evolve to keep the ecosystem on a leash, end quote. For Foster et al., quote, the health benefits of the microbiome should be understood and studied as an interplay between microbial competition and host control, end quote. Dark designs indeed. In what ways might our own community engagements be shaped on a leash? What forces direct our work, whether anthropogenic or otherwise? While we're clearly still thinking through these connections, we think there are rich areas of exploration between community writing, rhetoric, composition, and plant ecology that demand more thinking. In the near term, we see some important metaphorical lessons we can draw from a metaphorically ecological notion of sphagnum community building. We think that sphagnum community building can offer humans inspiration for co-living, co-writing, and co-creating dynamic communities. We understand from the ways that sphagnum works actively, viscerally, continually, to create the type of community necessary for its survival and success, that writing too might help us create the kinds of inclusive, equitable, and just communities necessary for our shared success, and might co-create too the kinds of acidic conditions that might prove importantly hostile to racist, misogynist, ableist, homophobic, and other deathly elements. We might take inspiration from the experience of walking tenuously and gingerly on a sphagnum bog, walking lightly, exploring directions, searching for stability and depth, but remaining fleet of foot, responsive, attuned. We might consider the types of flexible, sometimes invisible, infrastructures that support our work and the conditions we need to co-create for that work. But we wonder, too, whether we can push those metaphorical, analogic lessons in trophic ways. Most pragmatically, the act of taking ecology seriously enough to co-author this talk together has offered some surprising connections. Lily and I have helped co-write this plant-thinking community into existence in some ways. Further, we want to take this trophic approach to recognize that sphagnum moss might show us how to see community in new, dynamic, multiple, de-centered, and non-human directed ways, to understand the relational and physical dynamics of community building, and to recognize the power and agency implicit even in networked approaches, to consider the physical forms of relationality that connect us, a broad, not just human us, in surprising ways and from which we might build, to recognize that there are more distributed, dispersed microbial connections among us, to see connections, relations, and forms of exchange that might be difficult to detect but no less important, to find growth in literal physical decay, and to give ourselves over to the recognition that we are sometimes part of someone or something else's